It looks like we're live.
Yes, I think so. You are now in real time on Facebook with a link to people who wants to come with us. So it's okay for the real time now. I think so. People who wants to come with us. Yes, some people are coming. It's okay for the real time now. I think so. People who wants to come with us. Yes. Okay. You understand that the real time, the real streaming are okay. Now, I propose to record. Yes. And thank you so much to accept this invitation. Please close your microphone. Yeah, thank you so much. Oh, I put out your microphone. Okay, thank you so much. Hello, everyone. I'm very happy to welcome you in this strange encounter. Yes. Hello, everyone. I'm very happy to welcome you in this strange encounter between several continents live in real time. 40 years after the death of a psychoanalyst, Jacques Lacan, it's from Paris that I have it you, when my English is very bad, to discuss with 4 researchers, or 4 examples, Georges Bataille, William Burroughs, Catherine Christine Enix, from the electronics arts to Lacan back. Thank you very much in the order of speeches, lasting half an hour, including debate. Tim Themi from Australia, Marcus Boon from Canada, Vanessa Sinclair from Sweden, and David Schwarz from United States, New Mexico, exactly. Thank you very much for being with us today. Also for the 120 years of the birth of Jacques Lacan. So, if I am a psychanalyst in Paris, it's after having also worked with a visionary scenographer, Jacques Lacan. But that is another story. Today, it's as a psychanalyst who will remain silence, that I invite you to listen to some researches, books, and articles about Lacan and the arts in English. Do not hesitate to introduce yourself in a few words before your time. And now, Mr. Tim Themi from Australia, it's your voice. And thank you so much to accept my invitation.
Thank you very much, Frank. It's a pleasure to be here talking about one of my most favorite topics, Lacan and the arts. And for me in particular, I'm going to talk about Lacan and Bataille and the arts, as Vanessa's holding up, as I do in my most recent book, Eroticizing Aesthetics in the Real with Bataille and Lacan. And my own background is originally science, then philosophy, and then Lacanian psychoanalysis, which I did as a PhD under Russell Grigg, who you'll know as a translator of the Lacanian seminar, one of the translators, and president of the Lacan Circle of Australia, which I'm associated with, as well as being a teaching academic in Melbourne, Australia. So the topic, Lacan and the arts, Lacan, Bataille and the arts. I'm going to first draw a kind of distinction between the two and say for Lacan, arts is about sublimation, whereas for Bataille, art is about desublimation, or what's sometimes called the inscription of perversion. Why does Bataille want to inscribe perversion in our sublimations of art? Why does he want to desublimate it, if you like? It's because, and this is his sort of basic Nietzschean, Freudian influence, he thinks our sublimations have flown too high and become neurotic substitutions instead. For Nietzsche, of course, the obvious example was the whole history of Christian Platonic metaphysics. And it was a construct, it was a creation, it was defined as opposite to anything earthly and sensory and aesthetic, and it was seen as more real than the real itself, as Lacan puts it too. For Plato, The idea is the real for him. It's more real than the real itself. That's a problem. It creates the split. It creates a laceration between the high and the low, or the human and the animal. And that's why Bataille wanted to inscribe perversion there and desublimate. And this happens first off in his confrontation with André Breton's surrealism. He accused Breton of having an Icarian complex, flying too high for the sun being the like classic metaphor for the sovereign good that Plato uses in the Republic. So this happened in Bataille's Documents journal, where all the dissident surrealists that Breton had fallen out with had gathered, and Bataille was practicing his brand of dissident surrealism there, what he also calls base materialism, where he's saying even when we're materialists, we've overturned this Platonic idealist structure and we're falsifying the material data. It's an inadequate material reference, whether it's in intellectual life or in our aesthetic life. We're always trying to leave out certain parts of the materiality of existence. And this is exactly the part that both Lacan and Bataille sometimes call the real. Lacan always calls it the real, but Bataille sometimes calls it the real too. Often he will describe it as the heterogeneous, that which is excluded from the symbolic. So he talked about this base materialism. He talked about the formless. Whenever we posit forms, there's always the formless, which undercuts it and brings it back down to earth. He talked about the language of flowers, the beautiful petals and roses reaching towards the sun. He's like, don't forget the roots wallowing in the shit. If it wasn't for the roots in the shit, you wouldn't have these pretty almost feminine kind of metaphorizations up the top. All he's trying to do is like restore the cycle. So he's not trying to desublimate just to like throw us into the muck and leave us there, which is what Breton accused him of. He's just trying to restore the cycle between the low and the high, so that when we sublimate, we don't cut ourselves off from the roots that allow us to reach the heights, and the heights don't fly off like Icarus and forget about the obvious shit stain on the trousers, which is one of the examples that Bataille uses in a work of Dali, the shit stain on the trousers. Now, what's Lacan say about all this? You might think this is completely un-Lacanian, but for those who are experienced with the seminar, you read Seminar 7, The Ethics of Psychoanalysis, and you see Lacan using this base materialist sort of or desublimation move as well. So, for example, he gives the example of Saint Martin and who gives his cloak to the beggar, right? The naked beggar. And Lacan, he sublimates this sort of mythos that we get from the Christian world. He says, how do you know that Martin didn't want to be like fucked or killed instead? Harsh, right? Just straight down to the real in a sense, to keep it real, right? To stop us from floating off in denaturalized or Puritan mythos. He talks about the church mothers, if you like, the nuns, the female mystics who one drank the wash water of a leper's feet, another like ate the excrement of a sick man, right? And Lacan says the eroticism of these examples is veiled. Let me slightly tweak them and you'll see that there is a jouissance of transgression there, an eroticism. What if instead she ate the cum of a handsome young rugby forward, right? Or what if instead she ate the like excrement of a beautiful young gaudy, beautiful young girl? Then you suddenly, with a slight tweak, you see that there is a veiled eroticism there, the kind of excessive hyperbolic excess that comes from the history of Christian asceticism and eroticization. And so when Lacan talks about, the real is always in the same place, or psychoanalysis begins with the slag of a fantasy, or psychoanalysis enters into the abandoned field, the discredited field of the abject objects, the objects that philosophy leaves behind from Plato and Socrates. This is in Seminar 8, when it starts idealizing about the heights in a way that cuts us off from the roots too much, and then tries to stick up the top there and declare war from there against the bottom, as if it can get rid of earthly, animal, or the associated fluids and acts and desires that go with that. Now, we also, by the way, see this move in Freud a little bit, right? When he talks about Leonardo da Vinci, he says, I know my opponents are going to accuse me of just trying to blacken the radiant. You're going to take this great Renaissance artist and figure and say, he's really a closeted homosexual who dealt with the loss of his mum's breast in his mouth by fantasizing about her dick in his mouth, right? And Freud saying, no, I'm not doing that at all. All I'm doing is showing that the tendencies that we discover in the unconscious are there in everyone, in everything. Even in the great sublimator like Leonardo, you see elements of desublimation in there, elements of perversion, elements of neurotic reaction formation, which explains why Leonardo would hesitate and vacillate and not finish projects and lots of delaying, completely neurotic in essence. It doesn't take away from what he achieved. So there's hope for all of us here. He's just trying to like create knowing awareness of the high and the low and create a little conduit between them so we can stabilize that structure a little better. And that's what Bataille commends Freud for when Bataille is talking about base materialism. He said, we're going to use direct observation like we get from Freud. That's a quote from his documents journal. Now, what's Bataille want to do overall? He wants to create a cycle between the lows and the highs. So he's not just endorsing art that's completely perverse. He's certainly not endorsing art that's just completely neuroticized and desexualized and spiritualized. He wants to keep that cycle, right? And he links that between the animal side of us, accessible through the transgression of the taboos and animality we make in order to move towards the order of things. And that order of things is a symbolic register of Lacan, right? And that's governed by prohibitions and taboos on the real or on animality. But when it's time for aesthetics, that's when Bataille thinks we should practice the transgression of those taboos within other limits. The symbolic register is still there, but the imaginary comes to dominate. That's art, the imaginary where our divine animality comes back and returns to us in magnified, aestheticized form. And when that periodicity, it talks about a periodicity there, that's there in the initial French sociological tradition that Freud talks about too in Totem and Taboo. There's time for taboo, there's time for transgression, festival, transgression, back to work, build your reserves, taboo. All right, art is about the transgression, right? Then you return back to taboo, but you keep them in a cycle, right? Art predominates with imaginary and transgression. Science, politics, work predominates with the symbolic register, the time for respect for taboos. And by having this more of a harmony between these two, a kind of eternal return, we're able to fine tune the cycle too, as we sort of go through those iterations, never flying too high, never reducing too low. And the other important thing about aesthetics is that it really is the time, not just for transgression, return to animality, but a time for what he calls sovereignty, right? A sovereignty of the drives, a sovereignty of that sort of prohibited animality. So it's the opposite to the Christian Platonic tradition, which is premised on a sort of a despising of the animal body, as Nietzsche calls it, a hatred of the animal, right? Beating that animal with more and more taboos, as if that's going to get rid of it forever. And when it just proliferates the perversions, then that sort of Christian neurotic Platonic structure calls for more power to repress more, which of course proliferates it more, and the endless cycle goes on. And that's how you move from the first Enlightenment in the West, right? Started with classical Greece, where, you know, players of Sophocles and Aeschylus would perform as part of the Dionysus festival, to the horrors of the Crusades and the Inquisitions that, you know, for example, Freud talks about in Civilization and its discontents, right? And he thinks that Nietzsche's work is very important. And this is where like Bataille kind of like looks at like Nietzsche, looks at Marx and says, Nietzsche's about the sovereignty of the drives. Marx is about being rational across politics, fair distribution of resources as a whole. And he thinks both are very important. Nietzsche belongs to the sovereignty of the drives and animality. Marx belongs to the return to taboos and prohibition, being rational across the whole of politics, where we've got the whole thing mixed up, right? In politics, we've got all these horrible transgressions, inequalities, the return of fascism. It's a nightmare where our art is sort of trying to like sometimes portray itself as the kind of new theology, the new version of the Bible, moralizing everyone with its display of political correctness. We've got that upside down still. We're still stuck in Christian Platonism. That's the Bataillean message. Turn it back the right way. And I think we've also got this message basically in the ethics of psychoanalysis. It's about replacing repression with a more secure procedure, right? And more play to truthfulness, to quote Freud, from the resistances to psychoanalysis. And to do that is to restore sublimation of the drives instead of repression of the drives. And I think I might leave it there. Thank you. You're on mute, Frank.
I need to open my microphone.
You're on mute, Frank.
I said that you have some people in real time. And
I need to open my microphone. You're on mute, Frank.
I said that you have some people in real time. Okay. We have some synchronization out. We are now in real time in Facebook too. We have some commentaires, some people who have some questions, and we have perhaps some question on the chat. No. Yes, of course. David, you are welcome. Please, David Schwarz. You can open. Yeah, thank you so much, David.
Okay, there's an incredible amount of feedback, so I hope I'm not resonating across the world here. Tim, that was unbelievably exciting and fantastic. I really, really appreciate it. I have a question about this idea of restoring the cycle between high and low. So I'm wondering if you know of certain artists or periods in art which tend to resist that restoration.
Yep, there is. In fact, there's a good chunk of Bataille scholarship that really thinks that the message of Bataille is to be against aesthetics, to be just about the lows, the base material, the formless. Yeah, but I think they miss the subtlety of Bataille's critique. His critique of aesthetics in the early 1930s in the Documents Journal was a critique of idealism in aesthetics that tried to fly too high. So it's about restoring that cycle. And of course, there's lots of other art that tries to be a kind of, a Christian moral sort of, lecture or sermon, if you like, to the population, getting that art politics relation completely the wrong way around from this Bataille, Nietzsche, Freud, Lacan perspective.
Sure. Just very briefly, I'm wondering if you know of certain practices of music making or art, which, whether or not the practitioner knows anything about Lacan whatsoever, would, in your understanding and Bataille's understanding, resist or conform to this idea of restoring the cycle, particularly in popular music? Just curious.
Yeah, well, you could bring up lots of music which is sexual, it's about return to the dries, but you could also think of lots of popular music that does the opposite, that is more about moral dilemmas. Yeah.
Yeah, it's perhaps an enormously broad question. Yeah, thank you.
No worries.
Have you a question, Marcus?
Not right now. I think my talk will actually respond to that last question in a way that maybe is useful. I
agree with you, of course. You are on second position. That's the reason. And perhaps, Vanessa, you have an interview with Tim between Sweden and Australia about the book. I see your book just near you, Tim. Perhaps you can. Can I see your book just near you, Tim, on the screen?
Oh, yeah. Do you want me to bring it closer?
Yes, please.
Okay, give me 1 second.
Okay. Oh, thank you. Thank you so much, Vanessa.
Yes, I just didn't want anyone to see that I was wearing boxer shorts from waist down, so I thought I'd mute the video for a second, as you do in the Zoom era. Yes, and on the back we've got some wonderful endorsers, Russell Grigg, Stuart Kendall, Michael Richardson, Jared Russell, and Alison Horbury. And there's also a wonderful podcast I was very blessed and fortunate enough to do with Vanessa early on in the year, which had some very interesting discussions.
Yeah, and you are a member of Australian Circle of Lacanian, that's true?
I'm an associate. I'm an associate, a long-term associate. I have a membership application pending. I've sort of been quite absent in order to write, and so it's pending until I just show more consistent showing up to things, which I've been doing over the last 9 months or so, and then reapply, and that's probably what will happen. So yeah, but I've been attending Lacan Circle events since it was founded in the mid 2000s. Yeah, but on and off, intermittently. But obviously, I had a close working relationship with the founder, Russell Grigg, him being the supervisor of my PhD on Lacan and Nietzsche, and that was the first book, which is that one over there. So that's that.
Yeah, of course, Ross Spencer, you can open your microphone, and excuse for my English, but if you are some question.
I'm just curious about, you referred to the LGBT community, Tim. Are you referring in the sense that they too have moved away from the real to that of the ideal, like in the sense of human rights? I mean, I would have thought the LGBTI community, with what they were advocating, was actually was liberating at its time.
You might have misheard. I don't think I mentioned the LGBT community at all.
Oh, I thought you did.
No. Roll the tape.
I must have misheard you when you were talking before. Sorry about that.
But no, absolutely.
But what is your views on the LGBTI with their liberation front with regards to perversion and so forth?
Oh yeah, like some of their art is incredibly liberating. In fact, their art display the transgression of the excessive taboos and prohibitions on homosexuality that occurred during the Christian era. And it just shows like some people in the Bataille literature think that transgression never changes the taboo. It's completely conservative notion, but I don't think that's true. I think sometimes when we cross over, cultural taboos, we learn that those taboos are wrong. They can have an activist function. So when LGBT art showed the crossing of the prohibitions, it actually, could help other people recover that desire in themselves. And help them fine tune and overcome those prohibitions. And it's not necessarily the case. So use an example, for example, LGBT pornography. And Lacan says in the Ethics Seminar, it's not necessarily the case that sublimation has to involve complete desexualization. That's when he gives the example of that poem from Courtly Love, when the lady asked the knight, okay, if you want to show your service to me, then you've got to blow my trumpet. In other words, go downtown. And the knight's like complaining, oh, am I going to do that? That's wrong. It could be this, it could be that. And it's really abject and gratuitous, this description. But Lacan's saying that, it's almost pornographic, almost scatological. But it's not necessarily the case that it's not sublimation anymore. It's still sublimation because it's still part of a fictional structure, right? An imaginary structure. It stages something. If you look at LGBT pornography, which is getting better and better funded all the time, as stigma reduces, I think it can be quite progressive in that sense. It can help us all have that lived experience and recover that aspect of us. Freud talked about the originary bisexuality in every human being, and it's a way that we can realize that those limits are wrong and not support them, fine tune them. And I think that's what we have done. As a community over the last century.
In the sense that the transgression of the law, for example, because it's now more liberated, you don't get the sort of bit of that erotica of actually transgressing the law in a perverted way to some extent. It's become more accepting. I just want to know your views on that.
But the limits shift all the time. We can still find other ways to be. We can pretend we're like in the priesthood, for example, role playing. That's where the imaginary becomes important. We're more liberal, but it's not universally accepted across every subject, across all parts of the world. It depends which subaltern group you're dealing with. Private attitudes can be different. So there's always still, and even for heterosexual subjects, there's still an incredible amount of possibilities for erotic transgression of taboos in there, because look, we're here, we're dressed up, we're educated, we're speaking. That requires prohibition of the animality within, and that means the desire there is damming up. But when it is time for release, it's still going to be an erotic process. Yeah.
So we have 2 hours together, and thank you so much, Tim from Australia. And now we are moving to Canada, at the opposite of the planet, with Marcus. I'm very happy to invite you, Marcus.
Yeah, thanks.
You can share your screen if you want. Okay, it's good. Thank you so much.
Just shifting things around. Okay. Yeah, hi everybody. I'm Marcus Boon. I teach English literature at York University in Toronto. And let me think. I'm not strictly a Lacanian, although I've actually done a part of a Lacanian analysis. But I've read Lacan, of course. And, you know, in terms of the last talk and Tim's work, I'm very interested in Bataille, and in the book, Nothing, 3 Inquiries in Buddhism, I attempted in my essay in that book to think about what a Bataillean version of Buddhism would be like. And a lot of that was done in dialogue with Zizek's comments on Buddhism and trying to rethink Buddhism according to Zizek's, I guess, Lacanian critique of kind of Western Buddhism and New Age neoliberal versions of Buddhism. So I just finished writing a book called The Politics of Vibration, Music as a Cosmopolitical Practice. And in that book, I'm really kind of trying to set out and explore Catherine Christa Hennicks's ideas about music and kind of develop an ontology of music from her ideas. I met Hennicks first about 20 years ago when I was researching the Indian raga singer Pandit Pran Nath, who Hennicks studied with. And we stayed friends. And over time, I just became interested in learning about her worldview and the sort of complex way in which she puts together ideas from a number of fields. And that work continues through to today. And I feel incredibly honored and privileged to be able to talk to her about things and to be able to share some elements of her unique worldview, and that's still fairly undocumented, I would say. So I'm just going to read something that I wrote. It's still an early stage in the sense that it's really just a report on what she thinks, and there's very little of my own kind of intervention or response to it, but I'm starting to think about that. So yeah, so Catherine Christa Hennicks is a Swedish-born musician, composer, mathematician, philosopher, and visual artist. Best known for her minimalist keyboard composition / performance, The Electric Harpsichord of 1976, Hennicks was a protege of Lamont Young and part of a circle of minimalist musicians and artists in New York and on the West Coast that includes Henry Flint, Terry Riley, Charlemagne Palestine, Marianne Ameche, and many more. Like a number of these figures, she was also a student of the Indian raga singer and teacher Pandit Pran Nath. Hennicks has continued to make music with her ensemble, the Khorasan Time Court Mirage. Bill. There's a recent picture of Hennicks with evidence that she has in fact read Lacan. Henniks's visual art career dates back again to the 1970s with a solo show at the Moderna Museet in Stockholm in 1976 and various installation projects in the 1990s around Europe. Henniks had a retrospective of her visual art practice entitled Traversée du Fantasme at the Stedelijk Museum in Amsterdam in 2018. As a mathematician, Henniks has collaborated over decades with the Russian dissident mathematician and founder of ultra-intuitionism, Alexander Essenin-Volpin, and has made contributions in metamathematics. As a philosopher and writer, she also has a rich body of work, much of it attempting to synthesize her various interests, Parmenides' concept of the one, just intonation-based musics, category and topos theory in mathematics, Lacanian psychoanalysis, and more recently, Sufi philosophy and practice in Islam, into a single coherent worldview. And this work is now documented in the recently published 2-volume collection, Poesy Matters, Other Matters, published by Blank Forms. In giving an account of Henniks's interest in Lacan, it is precisely this diversity of intellectual and artistic interests, which are synthesized with elements of Lacan's work, that make it challenging to summarize her thought in 20 minutes. I'll talk briefly about specific works of Henniks's that reference Lacanian themes, notably the Triptyque Lacanien, paintings, and the Pas les Femmes installation of the early 90s, and the extraordinary set wall installation, which dates back to the 1970s, but which was recently shown in Bolzano. But I will focus on Henniks's integration of Lacanian ideas and themes into her philosophy of art via a series of statements and texts that begin with the La Séminaire essay of 1992, La, barred or crossed out, after which references to Lacan can be found in many, if not all, of her writings. In brief, Henniks is interested in Lacan's logic or topology of the unconscious and of mathemes as extra-linguistic vectors or functors for producing psychotropic effects and elevated states, and in thinking of artworks and practices, including music, as types of matheme that initiate what she, after Italian psychoanalytic feminists of the 1970s, calls a practice of the unconscious.
Marcus, one point. We didn't see your PowerPoint.
You can't wait. You can't see. Really?
Really.
Okay.
We have just, yes.
Now you can see it?
Yes, the first picture is now on the screen.
Okay, cool.
With Catherine Christer, yeah.
Yeah, thanks for pointing it out.
Yeah, excuse me.
Let me see. Conversely, she is interested in the prevalent resistance to and ignorance of such elevated states, which are often associated with, for her, with the Parmenidean figure of the one, or monism, or an undivided universe. And I would add to that, you know, in relation to the talk we just heard on Bataille, that there's a kind of interlacing of an idea of the one, the Lacanian real, the continuum in mathematics, and a kind of quantum mechanical set of ideas of an entangled universe. And Henniks kind of moves between those and tries to kind of show continuities between those different concepts. Much of the above that I just set up is captured in one of Henniks's more well-known mathemes, in inverted commas, found in La Séminaire. Here you have the mathematical sign for the integral in integral calculus, first introduced by Leibniz in 1675, integral calculus being used to calculate areas and volumes associated with continuous curves by breaking an interval into infinitesimal units, which summed provide an accurate measure or calculation of size or volume. Here, the integral function is superimposed on the line that passes from the one, to a, or objet petit a, the secret or hidden object of desire sought in desire for an or the other in Lacan's work. Often understood as a way of thinking about the persistence of partial or transitional objects into adult psychic life and of the misrecognition involved in object relations, objet petit a is both the exterior object's status as a projected object of desire and the lost object that is desired but not recognized as such. In Hennicks's formulation here, objet petit a is linked to the one as a kind of ultimate lost object. In other words, it's the one that ultimately is that has been lost. And if you've read Seminar 20, you'll know that there's a whole discourse of the one in that text, although Lacan insists that the one that concerns him the most is that of a sexual relationship. There is a line, a transit from the one to objecthood and the object of desire. The kernel of such desire is the one, and the line indicates both the separation of objet petit a from the one and the one's persistence in the object of desire. For Hennicks, the drama of the subject consists in being somewhere on this line, but never able to find an equilibrium or a vantage point from which to apprehend the situation. Excuse me. But this line, as we all know, is also the Lacanian notation for barring. Superimposed on the integral symbol, the line indicates that the gap or line between the one and objet petit a bars the integral or integration. Conversely, the integral superimposed on the barring line indicates the possibility of a reversal or negation of the barring. The practice of the integral, properly conceived, and can effect the integration of objet petit a back into the one, since the line, rather than being a line that indicates a separation, also indicates a continuity. In other words, it connects. This continuity itself is a figure or notation of the one, especially in Brouwerian intuitionism, a kind of key early 20th century school of mathematics that Hennicks is particularly interested in, whose founding gesture is a cut in the number line that allows for the production of mathematical entities, but which carries with it the continuity in which the cut occurs. The integral carries with it the pathos of being a kind of approximation of the calculation of continuity itself, given that a real summation of all of the infinitesimals in any interval is in the end impossible. Like infinitesimals never end, so if you add them up, you never reach the end of the addition in a sense. And in that sense, can itself be seen as a figure of the barring of the one. But it also suggests that the establishment of continuity between the one and objet petit a is calculable, or if you like, mathematizable. In this sense, the Lacanian matheme, which is often not much more than a symbolic formalization rather than an actual part of the world of mathematics, becomes for Hennicks a truly mathematical matheme, given that a logical or computable or mathematically iterable function, functor or operator, is speculatively indicated by the symbol. In other words, she actually believes that you can mathematically draw the one back to objet potentiel and reverse. Furthermore, the math theme that we are looking at indicates an operation on a kind of space. For Hennigs, the abstraction of space known as a topos and the elements of the math theme can be thought of as particular ways of occupying that space or of changing either the particular iteration of that which occupies space according to a particular structure, i.e. a morphism, or of effecting a more radical shift from one structure or category that orders this space to a different one that nonetheless is capable of inhabiting that space. Going back to the 1970s, Hennigs's concepts of algebraic aesthetics and epistemic art are aligned with this math theme in that her work seeks out a logic or a formalization or an algebra that is articulated as an artwork, whether a just intonation tuned musical work or a painting, in which a logic unfolds in a space. Thus, algebraic aesthetics generates an epistemic art whose goal is knowledge, a theory of the subject, to use Badiou's phrase. This is just a part of what is going on for Hennigs in this single math theme. But perhaps having established that Hennigs is in fact engaging with Lacan, we can step back and speak biographically a little. Hennigs first read Lacan in the 1960s, but says that the reading did not at that time make an impression on her. Nonetheless, it's worth observing that Hennigs's key works of the 1970s are framed by the problem of subjectivity and of the mathematico-logical approaches to human freedom via art practices that would mobilize them. Hennigs is interested in the logical structure of the subject in relation or non-relation to its ontological foundations. In the early 1990s, when Hennigs returned to Europe from the USA and was shifting from a focus on music to an installation-based visual art practice, she read Lacan again, and notably Seminar 20, Encore, on feminine sexuality. This was also a time when she was exploring her own transition and her relation to sex and gender norms. Between 1991 and 1996, she regularly visited Paris, attended Jacques Miller's seminars, and participated in various Parisian Lacanian splinter groups, as well as talking with the more broadly psychoanalytic thinker Monique David Ménard, whose work on the history of hysteria was crucial for her. Hennigs produced a number of installation pieces in this period, which were exhibited first at the Fodor Museum in 1992, in Stockholm, in Paris at the Espace Tanguy in 1994, and other places in Europe. Some of these installations involve her triptyque Lacanien painting, which juxtaposes some of Lacan's math themes with her homotopies, and I'll go into what that means in a bit. These pieces were accompanied by the important text La Séminaire, La Clostal, subtitled Intervention Zero, perhaps as a playful other seminar that would precede Lacan's seminars 1 to 24. In other words, somehow it would come before the seminars that actually existed, and Hennigs obtained these seminars, which are kind of sit in her studio like kind of religious objects next to the collected works of Jean Coltrane and the Springer Verlag meta-mathematical volumes. She obtained these copies in Lacanian circles in the samizdat copies that were circulating at that time. In brief, I argue that Hennigs's response to Lacan's Encore seminar is to turn it into a kind of how-to manual. feminine jouissance, as presented in that text, offers an ontology, a goal, a site. Lacan presents a problem, a paradox, a barred state, which Hennick's dryly refers to as an epistemology of prohibitions, which Lacan himself, according to Hennick, shares with the obsessional neurotic. In response, Hennick proposes a logical approach to its dissolution, and that's a quote. For Hennick, at core, the neurotic refuses a knowledge that in fact they already have, especially in relation to jouissance. If objet petit is defined as a distance from the lost object of desire, Hennick speculates on what might happen if that distance collapsed, diagramming this collapse by an extraordinary set in which a set of bracketings of the empty set gives rise to a set of distinctions which still carry with them a kind of non-dual empty one. This collapse can be read in many ways, including in terms of the collapse of sexual difference. So there's from Bolzano, the latest version of this set, and you can see the empty set, which is the bracketed set with nothing in it, that a series of further bracketings establishes both a kind of counting system, but in a sense, all of the distinctions of the phenomenal world, but that this bracketing continues almost infinitely and essentially folds back into the one. Thus, the empty set and the one are kind of put in tension in this sort of mathematical formulation. Thus, we have the title of one of her installations of this period, Par les femmes, but not quite in the way that, say, Hélène Cixous argued in Life for the Medusa, or for that matter, Julia Kristeva in her works on abjection. If masculine jouissance is predicated on the enjoyment of a phantasm covering up a lack, and feminine jouissance is posited as being ontologically true, but impossible to speak of, Par les femmes proposes a kind of speech that would reliably lead to that position or speak from that position or site of feminine jouissance, beyond language, but not beyond method or math theme or painting, as we see in the triptych Lacanien, where a reversible color field, a homotopy, vibrates behind the mathemes, and you can see the two homotopic paintings on either side of this algebraic painting in the middle here, and this is a kind of new version of the triptych Lacanien, or related kind of formulation. Or in Hennick's sound works, where a just intonation drone evokes and iterates the harmonics of a monistic universe in which individual melodies, improvisations find and loses themselves. Of this grounding, non-discursive but immanent sort of ontological space, Hennick says, quote, "There is an exile from the forms of language as we have come to know them that awaits anyone at this beyond of the signification, a new church of language, a new passage into the body where the unwritten laws of the real are confirmed at the moment of their revelation." Hennick argues that it is, quote, "in the promiscuous dimensions of the arts," unquote, that, quote, "alternative ontologies of emergence and disappearance may occur." So that the problem of the subject may be considered an aesthetic one, in the sense that aesthetics would define the possibilities of such a new language of the body, one which Hennick associates with Artaud and with the Buto dancer Yoko Ashikawa and her text Searching for the Other Person in the Body. It should be noted that in La Séminaire, Hennick also considers Bataille inner experience and non-knowledge, but criticizes his reliance on accident in entering the space of non-knowledge. In other words, It's not enough for Hennigs that art might accidentally produce a state of non-knowledge. She wants there to be a method, a practice that reliably leads to that state. As the essay concludes, quote, "It is in the nakedness of this movement of the Buto dancer, in this bare dance step of utter darkness, in which the residue of symbolization, objet petitart, resides, and which, by a logic of its own, permits us to sense the cause of our desire under the weight of an incomprehensible existence." Some version of this core argument of Hennigs's about attaining the dignity of a realignment with the one, away from what Brouwer called the sad world, is contained in a number of places in Hennigs's work. For example, it is captured nicely in this longish quote from an essay that accompanies her composition Blues Alif Lam Mim, Blues in Ba, performed by her ensemble at Issue Project Room in New York in 2014. The quote comes from the end of an essay where Hennigs is summarizing what the aim of the 75-minute sound composition is, and her integration of a Sufi spiritual practice of sound into her worldview of Brouwer, mathematics, Lacanian psychoanalysis, etc. I'll comment briefly as I read the quote. So quote begins, "There is nothing illogical about divine love, except it brings in a universe of discourse which is beyond the laws of classical logic. You are now what you hear yourself hear. Wo es war, soll ich werden, Freud." So, yeah, where it was, should I be, should I become, find myself, be. The incorrigible S bends the Ich back towards its origins, its Ursprache, Wittgenstein, a kaleidoscopic hybrid of signifiers presented as sound and light, whose noimas are preserved and returned by memory. The syntax is jumbled and the semantics carry strange, if only vague, cross-references. This is the realm of the unconscious, which opens itself in the dream state, which is here activated by difference tones in the range 30 Hertz to 100 Hertz. In Sufi mysticism, what happens in the dream state is accorded a higher degree of reality than any perception suffered in the state of being awake when other brainwave frequencies are activated and screen the world of dreams. This is indeed also the ultimate ontology of Lacanian psychoanalysis. However, while psychoanalysis treats the traits of this ontology as pathological and a hindrance to being in its social function, the Rumi cure, i.e. Sufism, i.e. her sound project, accesses the dream state in order to liberate the mind from the impact of a chronic dysfunctional social order which leaves anyone caught by it disturbed. It must be noted, as Parmenides did 2,500 years ago, that the laws of classical logic furnishes this dysfunctional order by bending and binding the mind to its narrow scope. Being shortchanged from running on or acted by the wrong program, see the recent similar view by the mathematician Brouwer, the path to divine love offers an alternative program for being to run on, which escapes the shackles of classical logic and returns it, being, to a freedom of thought which nourishes an affect towards dignity and social independence governed by an aesthetics of the sublime. Ultimately, this path, tariqa, harbors an alternative culture where shrines are dedicated to sounds which expand the mind to its other openings. Hadiths speak of this other world as a corner in Allah's paradise, where sound is God, where absolute silence is the ultimate sound. Om Saha Stranama. So here you have a mostly modal composition of sustained tones performed electronically and by voices and by a variety of instruments that is part of a program for accessing and sustaining states of ontological equilibrium and grounding. For Henniks, Lacan offers a profound and rigorous statement of the problem that the subject faces, that the subject in fact is, in the sense that they misrecognize what they are and what their potentiality is. In an important note, comment in her Sono Illuminescences booklet of 2017, and I'm drawing to a conclusion here, Henniks posits this problem in terms of Lacan's concept of l'étourdi, literally dazed or unfocused, but also punning on a turn, tour, that speaks, dit. The subject is dazed by exposure to the symbolic order, to language, to the law of the father, which turns the mind in a way that is non-commutative, as Henniks says, i.e. not capable of being reversed. That would be Lacan's position, maybe. But according to Henniks, a reversal is potentially possible. And she's referring here to her own musical work, but also that of others. The world de-signifies itself by being re-centered around a single signifier, which is immediately recognized and that reveals a parallel world with an alternative semantics, which abolishes all distinctions and therefore necessarily, but not perhaps without a sense of paradox, also the distinction between the lover and the beloved. This is the ultimate form of monism or unity of being, anahak. So that's as far as I've gotten with this. But I think my own kind of conclusion summary would simply be to say that Henniks's interest in Lacan has to do with a therapeutic vision of what art is, and that therapeutic vision can't just be based on platitudes or generalizations, but that the therapy has to be truly precise, and that there is a kind of precision or a logic which is possibly attainable. Paradoxically, though, in Henniks's own work, there is always a jump from logic to a kind of miracle. And somehow the logic is supposed to create the miracle, which is the elevated state, et cetera, or the return to the one. And it's very enigmatic what that relationship is. I don't understand it, even though I've experienced it myself in our work and in our company. But yeah, I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you, Marcus. Any questions? The exchange is open, and I'm very happy because the works of Catherine Christine Henniks, nobody knows the works and the relationship with Lacan. And take the line, please, Tim.
Thank you, Frank, and thank you, Marcus, for a wonderful talk. Just wondering if you could expand some more on the reference to Bataille's thesis of non-knowledge and the critique that emerged out of that. I was sort of having in mind also Lacan's, it was released as a book recently in English, Talking to Brick Walls, where Lacan complained that people were coming in and invoking Bataille and invoking non-knowledge as if there was no such thing as psychoanalytic knowledge. And Lacan says, hey, hang on a second, Bataille mentions non-knowledge in one or two important places, but God knows he didn't have a field day with it. There's there's three main parts of his work, and that's the middle part, the meditative part during the occupation. But the focus on chance was also part of his reinvestment of surrealism after the war, which he used to sort of cut against the surrealists, Sartre in particular, and their rise at the expense of psychoanalytically informed surrealism. So I was wondering if you could expand on what the critique was of Bataille, non-knowledge and chance that you mentioned.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I have my own thoughts about it, but I'll talk a little about what I think Hennigs is saying. First of all, I guess there's a question of whether non-knowledge corresponds or does not correspond to a concept of the one. And this itself is a kind of tricky issue because the one in the Parmenidean version and in Hennigs's reading of it is not a one of identity. It's a one of a kind of ultimate totality that in some sense incorporates everything into it. It is connected to a mathematical idea of continuum or continuity. Although Bataille non-knowledge is usually framed in terms of negation, it's interesting that in Bataille's work, there are repeated references to the continuum and continuity, and that for Bataille, the achieved state of non-knowledge is one of non-separation and continuity with the universe. And Derrida, for example, has some very interesting passages on Bataille where he talks about the problem or paradox of continuity in Bataille's work and of a notion of a kind of ultimate monism that would not be based on a kind of identity. And it's very interesting in Derrida's work that you could say that Derridean difference also thinks about that problem of whether there is a one of difference ultimately or not. So, I mean, there's a kind of philosophical issue there, I think, in Bataille's work as to what he really means by continuity or non-knowledge and what the achieved state of that consists of. I think what Hennigs is saying in the passage I'm talking about is that Bataille in the end believes chance is the method. And Hennigs would just say that reliance on randomness or chance is unrigorous, and that it isn't really a method at all from a certain point of view. It's just a kind of random or speculative encounter with non-knowledge. That's not strictly true because Bataille actually, he does have a text, for example, called Method of Meditation, but the method there, again, it's not really clear that it is truly a method. Whereas Hennigs is interested in there actually being a logic by means of which something like non-knowledge would occur. And but as I said, there's the paradox there, I guess, is that despite there being such a logic or several logics in Hennigs's work, all of which are aimed at attaining this kind of state of continuity or connection to the one, in the end, to me, there is always still a space or a gap there. And the miracle that happens as a result of the implementation of a logic is in the end never entirely explained by the logic itself, except that the assertion of a kind of monistic universe does seem to make explicit something that isn't in the end explicit in Bataille's work or most of sort of 20th century thinkers. I mean, you could argue that it's there in Deleuze, insofar as Deleuze is a monistic thinker, and if you've read Badiou on Deleuze, like you understand all the valences of that. But I mean, the question of what an accurate monistic philosophy is also a really interesting and complicated one. And I think from Hennigs's point of view, monism has been given a bad rap. And her interest in mathematics is an interest in how mathematical entities emerge from a kind of meditation on the one, finally. I don't know if that explains things.
Meditation, Vanessa, perhaps it's your time. If
Hello.
If you have urgent questions, we have time after the 4 talks. Don't worry.
Great. I always love to see how these kind of talks fit together. They feel like they're flowing together one after the next so nicely. And I feel like this will be an interesting kind of segue after Marcus's presentation. So thank you, Tim, Frank, and Marcus. Let's see if I can share my screen to you. But I want you to only see, excuse me. No. Let's try that again. There we go. Here we are. That's right. Now you see what's going to be a video. Yes, play button. Okay. Everyone can see that?
Yes, it's okay.
Just making sure. So this video is something I cut together from the original film called The Cut-Ups, which was Anthony Balch's work with William Burroughs and Brian Geisen. It came out in 1967. You see a little clip of that here. And then this part that you're seeing now is a film that my kind of third mind partner, like if I was Geisen, she would be Burroughs, Caitlin Foisey made. And then I'm also going to talk a bit about the artists Genesis and Lady J. Briar Peorage, because today is the day of death of Lady J. Briar Peorage, and I figured I can't do a talk about this without talking about her and them if I'm talking on her day of death. And so they also see some cut-in footage from their work together. If you don't know them yet, I'll talk a little bit about them as well as some photographs of them that my husband Carl Abrahamson has taken over the years. And then for myself, that's Lady J. Briar Peorage. For myself, I am a psychoanalyst in practice. I'm from the United States, but I live in Sweden, and I practice in Sweden and internationally with analyses all over the place. And I'm a senior research fellow at the Global Center for Advanced Studies, which is a university based out of Dublin, Ireland. But again, they have classes and courses and degrees internationally and are accredited in Europe. So a lot of that's online as well. So basically everything I do at this point is online, which is, I guess, the way of the world nowadays, as we are here. So this talk is about 20 to 22 minutes, I would say. In 1958, Brian Geisen was living at the Beat Hotel in Paris when he discovered what he later coined the cut-up method by chance. Geisen states, "While cutting a mount for a drawing in room number 15, I sliced through a pile of newspapers with my Stanley braid and thought of what I had said to Burroughs some 6 months earlier about the necessity for turning painters' techniques directly into writing. Geisen immediately began picking up raw words and phrases that he accidentally cut from the newspaper and piecing them together into texts that would end up becoming the first cut-ups. He noticed that although they weren't created intentionally, the phrasing and sentences that came together through this seemingly haphazard methodology seemed to make a certain kind of sense. He says, "At the time, I thought them hilariously funny and hysterically meaningful. I laughed so hard my neighbors thought I'd flipped. I hope you may discover this unusual pleasure for yourselves." Geisen shared this discovery with creative collaborators and fellow Beat Hotel residents, William Burroughs, Gregory Corso, and Sinclair Bales. And the group worked together with the method for a period, creating the first cut-up publication, Minutes to Go, in 1960. Burroughs and Geisen continued their work with cut-ups long after the group left the Beat Hotel. In fact, both men worked with the technique for the rest of their lives. They experimented with a variety of mediums, including text, audio, and visual imagery. They worked in quite a methodical fashion, keeping meticulous notes and documenting the results of their cut-up experiments and investigations, eventually culminating in the book, The Third Mind, which was published in 1978. The dedication reads, "To and for all our collaborators, at all times, third minds everywhere." The relationship between psychoanalysis and the fine arts is long and rich, and in fact has been present from the very beginning. Freud was developing the field of psychoanalysis. He applied his new and evolving concepts to the study of artworks and artists, including Da Vinci and Michelangelo. In The Moses of Michelangelo, Freud began, "I may say at once that I am no connoisseur in art, but simply a layman. Nevertheless, works of art do exercise a powerful effect on me, especially those of literature and sculpture." Freud, however, tended to critique art the way one would analyze a dream, by taking apart the various components of the piece and making greater sense of the whole through the exploration of its parts. Freud felt that by applying the method of psychoanalysis to art and literature, one may decipher the underlying meaning and intention of the creator, much as one analyzes the manifest content of a dream to unearth the latent. The advent of Jacques Lacan brought the concept of scansion into psychoanalytic theory and practice, highlighting the potential power and value that disruption of the narrative may have. The method of scansion has been applied throughout the arts, music, literature, and poetry, as well as in psychoanalysis, and in many ways, the effect can be similar. The cut-up method is integral to many art forms, including filmmaking, sampling of music, collage, performance art, and writing. William Burroughs states, "All writing is in fact cut-ups, a collage of words read, heard, overheard. What else? The use of scissors renders the process explicit and subject to extension and variation." Historically, in poetry, scansion is a method of describing the rhythm of a poem through the breaking up of its lines or verses into feet, working in meter, marking the locations of stresses, accented and unaccented syllables. Adapted from the classical method of analyzing ancient Greek and Roman verse to determine, scansion can be thought of in terms of scanning, examining a line or verse to determine its rhythm, thereby revealing the underlying mechanics or structure of a poem. The purpose of scansion is to enhance the reader's sensitivity to the ways in which rhythmic elements in a poem convey meaning. Deviations in a poem's metrical pattern are often significant to its meaning. This method of scansion has been utilized in a similar way regarding the rhythm and forms of pieces of music. After all, what is rhythm but a series of punctuations or cuts? If there were no cut, we would be left with one endless tone. In their paper, You're Kicking Me Out, Scansion and the Variable Length Session in Lacanian Clinical Praxis, Celeste Petrusa and Derek Hook state, by creating what might in poetry be thought of as a line break, scansion cuts analysand's speech, leaving them with a sense of ambiguity and multiplicity. The analyst does not directly interpret, and thus the last words of a session become not the very last words on a matter, but instead jumping off points for the analysand's free association and unconscious productions. One may see the similarities of scansion in poetry and music to that of not only Lacan's concept of scansion, but also to Freud's evenly suspended attention that the analyst is encouraged to maintain. Just as the reader scans a poem or piece of music to locate the underlying structure and rhythm, as well as deviations from that framework, the analyst attempts to maintain the free-floating attention conducive to noting signifiers, slips, double entendre, patterns of transference, displacement, condensation, metonymy, and metaphor. The cut-up method reflects something essential about the nature of the self and the construction of identity, in a way mirroring the formation of identity, subjectivity itself. We are born into a story, an already existing narrative. Even before we are born, our parents, family, and society have ideas of who we will be, what we will do, how we will succeed, what trials and tribulations we may face, all before we have even left our mother's body. We are subjugated in utero. Our identity is prescribed and not with us in mind. It is mapped out for us, structured, put into play, and is largely based on gender. The system is built on dichotomy, male, female, active, passive, 1-0, master, slave. But what happens when we begin to break down this system, push boundaries, surpass borderlines, and transgress limits? The deconstruction of the cut-up method lays bare the dynamics at play underneath the surface, giving us a glimpse of our real fragmented state, which we weave into a cohesive narrative through our use of identification and fantasy. We use fantasy to make ourselves feel whole, while our underlying sense of self and body feels fragmented. Perhaps this mirroring or mimicking of the underlying processes of the unconscious is what causes cut-ups to often feel resonant in a way that feels uncanny. Cut-ups make explicit a psychosensory process that is going on all the time anyway. That's a quote from Burroughs. Inspired by Burroughs and Guyson, British artist Genesis P-Orridge worked with the cut-up method throughout her lifetime. P-Orridge began exploring identity, pushing limits, and breaking boundaries since her earliest work with the Exploding Gallery Commune in 1969, where any semblance of routine or structure was completely dismantled. The interior walls of the building were torn down as much as possible, including the walls surrounding the bathrooms. Members were not to sleep in the same location 2 nights in a row. Meals were cooked at irregular times throughout the day. No one had their own money. All clothing was kept in the center of the room with a first come, first served policy each morning. This disrupted attachment to material possessions, personal space and privacy, as well as the blurring of boundaries between self and other. When it was discovered that leaders of the commune were not abiding by the same rules as the others in the house, P-Orridge left and founded the art collective Coombe Transmissions. As part of Coombe, she developed a practice of adopting various identities and living fully as each character for days on end, whether or not she liked or agreed with the belief system of the person chosen. Her experimentation continued in the avant-garde experimental music group Throbbing Gristle. Originally meant as a complement or side project to the work of Coombe Transmissions, Throbbing Gristle performed as part of the opening party for the exhibition Prostitution in 1976 at the Institute for Contemporary Arts in London. Although it ran for just 8 days, the prostitution exhibition caused such a stir in British popular media that the artists involved were infamously declared the wreckers of civilization. When introducing the group's first musical performance, P-Orridge announced, "Tonight we're going to do a 1-hour set called Music from the Death Factory. It's basically about the post-breakdown of civilization. You know, you walk down the street and there's a lot of ruined factories and bits of old newspaper with stories about pornography and page 3 pinups blowing down the street. And you turn a corner past the dead dog and you see old dustbins. And then over the ruined factory, there's a funny noise." Throbbing Gristle was that funny noise, capturing the essence of just such a scene, and in so doing, reflecting an era. The tongue-in-cheek moniker soon became the driving force for this group of performance artists, who in time would become known as pioneers of industrial music. Inspired by the cut-up method and tape experience of Guyson and Burroughs, the members of Throbbing Gristle experimented with a range of sounds, always in an unconventional manner. The group was one of the first to utilize sampling techniques and tape delays, cutting, repeating, and distorting sound in previously unheard of ways. Perhaps because this band was formed out of a performance art collective, the medium of sound was approached with an artistic sensibility in mind rather than with traditional musical sensibility. Upon the dissolution of Slavengrissel in 1981, Peter Christofferson and Genesis Purge went on to found the Temple of Psychic Youth, also known as TOPY, and Psychic Television, focusing on ritual magic and cut-up experimentations in the new and burgeoning field of videotape. During the era of the Satanic Panic, Purge and TOPY came under media scrutiny, eventually culminating in the raiding of the Temple of Psychic Youth UK headquarters by Scotland Yard. Purge fled to the United States, where she met her second wife, Lady J. Breyer, a performance artist prominent in the club scene of New York City's Lower East Side, who was working as a nurse and a dominatrix. Over time, the pair immersed themselves in their own cut-up experimentations, exploring and dismantling ideas of identity, the body, consciousness, gender, and sexuality at a depth few have dared to traverse. They took the process that much further, applying the cut-up method not only to word, sound, and image, but to the very real of their own bodies and their selves, their identities, in a third mind-esque project they called Pandrogyny. The pair chose the moniker Breyer Purge as an expression of their dedication and commitment to this mutual endeavor. In an effort to break down prescribed notions of themselves as gendered individuals so that they could more fully come together as one, Breyer and Purge underwent a series of surgical, medical, chemical, psychological, spiritual, and behavioral procedures spanning more than a decade. In the Pandrogyny Manifesto of 2006, Breyer Purge states, "Some people feel they are a man trapped in a woman's body. Some people feel they are a woman trapped in a man's body. Breyer Purge just feel trapped in a body." In a way, Breyer Purge seemed to have replicated the experience of the origin of the formation of identity as described by Lacan in the mirror stage by cutting up their own selves as individuals, emphasizing the sense of fragmentation while at the same time concurrently creating a mirror image in one another. Through this process, they then identified with the wholeness of the mirror image in the other, creating a new sense of mutual identity for the pair. Lady J writes, "I am making a mirror, something to see myself in." The experience of a union went well beyond what the artists anticipated. They said, "We are also beginning to slowly explore the surprisingly profound effects of being so lost, so totally and lovingly in the mirror of another being." In the Pandrogyny Manifesto, they state, "We see the eye of our consciousness as a fictional assembly or collage that resides in the environment of the body. One of the central themes of our work is the malleability of physical and behavioral identity. The body is used by the mind as a logo for the self before we are able to speak language." And I will also mention neither of them have ever read Lacan or Freud for that matter. So I thought that was an amazing observation on their part. The cutting of the real of the body has an effect on the psyche as we experience ourselves through this interface. In Freud's seminal work, The Three Essays on the Theory of Sexuality from 1905, he introduced his theory of childhood sexuality, outlining the oral, anal, and genital stages for the first time, and the claim that we are all born bisexual and intrinsically polymorphously perverse. The expert on sexuality and perversion at that time was Richard Kraft von Ebbing, who believed, as did society at large, and still it does often, that sex was solely for procreation, and any sexual act falling outside of the reproductive intention was considered to be perverse. Freud agreed with this definition of perversion, but stated that perversion is actually our natural inclination and is the norm. It even precedes the norm. Humans are sexual beings. Children are sexual beings. We are all perverse, and the entire body is sexual, not just the genitals and erogenous zones. Any part of the body can become eroticized, as can the gaze, smell, or voice. Years later, in 1923, in The Ego and the Id, Freud stated that our ego is first and foremost a body ego. We learn about ourselves and our world via our bodies, especially through our orifices, as these are the spaces where we exchange inside and out, ingest and discharge, are penetrated and expel. These sites are holes, openings, gaps, but also limits, boundaries, and surfaces. The rim of the mouth, anus, urethra, vagina, nostrils, nipples, eyes, and ears. What is the difference between those that seal versus those that remain open, or rather are unable to close? We may even consider the pores of the skin to be countless numbers of orifices, tiny mouths opening and closing more quickly or slowly, depending on our state, mood, level of stimulation, or relaxation. The body is inserted into culture through language. During this process, signifiers are inscribed into the body. The world we construct via our bodies does not necessarily align with a particular blueprint, nor with the specific functions of the body in the physical sense. Therefore, manipulating the physical body, reforming and reconstructing the body, whether it be through the prick of the tattooist's needle, the ritual cut of a knife, or the surgeon's scalpel, may have profound effects on the psyche. The cut engenders anti-normalization. Anything normative fixes desire, including our identity or ego, itself a construct formed via a lifetime of identifications and projections. As we begin to believe this construct is indeed ourself, it may become rigid and even stagnant. We are born into history, language, and social structures. Yes, our words and positions are not our own. We are introjected into an interplay of dynamics and discourses. However, ultimately, normalization fails. All paths that sexuality may take are equally valid and complex. In fact, Lacan called the heteronormative prototype the delusional normality of the genital relation. Scansion is a means to cut at these stories we are told and tell ourselves, allowing us space from them to momentarily glimpse the forces at work beneath, and to be able to make choices from our position within these discourses, rather than feeling as if we are constantly caught up in them, enacting and reenacting dynamics at play that we are not consciously aware of, but nevertheless affect us pervasively. In this way, scansion can be seen as another royal road to the unconscious, like free association and dreams. Resonant of the fundamental cut inherent in subjectivity itself, scansion highlights the divide between conscious, unconscious, self and other, dream and waking states. Geisen and Burroughs' cut-up method shows that the cutting up of language creates the space for something new to form. Breyer-Peorge illustrate that this also occurs with the cutting up of body, image, and behavior. Whether the cut of the scissor or the surgeon's scalpel, a gap or space is created. We are situated in this gap. By challenging and disrupting repetition of narratives, a space is created where we are able to produce something else. The cut-up method has proven to be effective not only when applied to word, image, and sound, but also to self, identity, gender, and sexuality. Sexuality is inherently subversive and is at our core. It is foundational to the essence of every subject. Ergo, a key way to subvert normalization is through disruption of the narrative of sexuality and thusly identity and gender. Thank you.
Wow, Vanessa, thank you so much for your cut-up experimental film of avant-garde of last century. I have some review that you said in my bibliothèque, And I know the story, of course, of Brian Gazin, William Burroughs, but I think it's a good opportunity because my English is so poor, but you understand another face of aesthetic is not aesthetic of Christine Enix, but you understand, but I know the Genesis Peerage, we have some friends together, and I met Genesis in Paris when he was in life. And very interesting because Lacanian, I'm very, we have two faces, French Lacanian, against or not against, identity, gender studies, and with the story of avant-garde in contemporary art with Enix, who is in life, we have a new way, a new face, a new wave to understand the situation of contemporary psychanalyst. And very interesting because you are a psychanalyst after your experience with avant-garde. And it's a very important point for now. But I'm not only, and my English is not so good to exchange, and perhaps some people have some questions from Australian or Canada, because you are just at the middle in Europe, or from New Texas. Perhaps you can close the screen.
Sure. And I think it fit nicely between what
Okay.
Marcus talked about and what David's going to talk about.
So shall I start?
David?
Yes.
Oh, David on first, okay.
Let me share my screen somehow. Can you see my screen by chance?
Not yet.
Not yet.
Okay.
Perhaps one question. Okay.
How about now?
The one slide, cast off Fondation de la Psychanalyse into that's true. That's good.
Okay. I want to make sure you can hear music. So let me make sure you can hear this.
Please.
Okay, great.
Perfect. After Genesis Peerage, Paganini is perfect.
Yes, exactly.
Very funny meetings, and thank you so much, David, because it's morning in Texas. Okay.
Yeah, it's very early. I'm the only person on this whole campus, I think, right now. Yeah, I would like to thank Frank very much for this invitation and for you all to be here. It's very much of an honor, and I really appreciate it. I can tell you very briefly about my book, An Introduction to Electronic Art Through the Teaching of Jacques Lacan, Strangest Thing, which is here. And that was an experiment, actually. I have never formally studied psychoanalysis. I have degrees in English, comparative literature, music theory, German, and interactive telecommunications. I've been reading Freud, Zizek, and Lacan for about 30 years. And my interest in psychoanalysis really corresponds to my son's life. I began to be interested in psychoanalysis right when he was born. And I would highly recommend that, actually, as a fortuitous thing to do, to raise a child and to start reading Freud, Zizek, and Lacan. It's an unbelievably powerful experience. So my book was an attempt to see what Lacan could say about interactive electronic art and what interactive electronic art could say about Lacan. So I spent several years finding a documentation of electronic art online, looking at as much as I possibly could where I live. And during a leave and a summer, I dedicated my entire life to reading everything Lacan had written that was published in English, which I did in a 9-month period, taking notes. And then I spent a year writing the book, bringing the two together. So my talk today is going to be a very brief outline of a work in progress that will end with an electronic art object and and topic that I think actually will be a very fortuitous way to round out this wonderful event. I can say right away that my work will find some resonance with the three talks that we've had just now. I touch upon the abject, which will echo with Tim, very much about the objet art, and I very much appreciate Marcus's contribution. And the scansion and the cut idea will resonate very powerfully with the music of George Rochberg. So let me just start with just three assumptions, just to sort of lay out my assumptions where I'm starting. I very much believe that art interpolates us as subjects in very thorough a way, similar to the way Althusser talks about gesture and language interpolating us as subjects. I also believe that art involves a very crystallized version of the imaginary, the symbolic, and the real, as much as any other representation or embodiment of experience in life. And I'm very much wedded to the idea of looking and listening awry, the idea that whatever text we take, we need to look at it straightforward to the best we can, and then to turn it into a sort of anthropomorphic gaze or an anamorphotic gaze to see what structures the manifestation hides. So that's where I'm coming from. And the idea that I'm pursuing today has to do with one of my obsessions, which is the violin virtuoso and virtuoso music and the whole idea of virtuosity as it arose in the 19th century. And in my work, I always start with a kind of Lacanian premise and then want to ground it in a case study. So I'll be showing you 4 little excerpts of pieces of music that are part of a gigantic arc of a kind of historical psychoanalytic development, which will take us from the dawn of the Romantic era in the early 19th century to the present. So let me begin with Paganini. So my thesis is this. I believe, or I'm wondering whether the emergence of the violin virtuoso in the mid-19th century is a compensatory action, or an unconscious compensatory reaction to the epistemological doubt opened up by the Enlightenment, which can be crystallized by that space occupied by the objet art in the Lacanian circle of drive and desire. So that's my thesis. Whether the virtuoso, Paganini in the violin, Liszt for the piano, is an attempt to both acknowledge and fill that enormous gap created in the structure of desire. And what I will be suggesting in the first 3 examples I'll show you is that I believe the fantasy of that gap opening up gets stronger and stronger. So I think there's an increased intensity, almost a kind of manic energy associated with the developing violin technique throughout the 19th and 20th century that culminates in something like extremely interesting that I will, with which I will conclude. By the way, I am fascinated by the ultimately phallocentric, male-driven fantasy that underlies virtuosity in the 19th century. And I, on purpose, have found performers that are all women. So these are all essentially male fantasies performed by women. And here is a very short excerpt of the Paganini 24th Caprice, the theme and the first variation. I know we all want to keep hearing the rest of the piece because it's magnificent. And just a little visual reinforcement that's very familiar to all of us. I believe that the objet art, as Marcus represented it so beautifully through the work of Hennig, is both a space that propels and blocks the drive, And I think what happens in human imagination and in art is that we take the energy generated by the objet art and we sort of transform it, sublimate it, give it form into what Kant would have referred to as the beautiful. And I still rather like and find useful Kant's definition of the beautiful as a representation of pure form that must be communicated to others in social space to create a fantasy of union with God, nature, and fellow man. Now, the Paganini is, I think, emblematic for a kind of beauty because it has a very clear signifier that points to a variety of manifestations in all the variations, right? So there's that theme, which is very, very clear, very diatonic. It has tonic, dominant, tonic, harmony. It's extremely clear. It will resonate with anyone as a kind of interpolative reminder of the laws of nature and man in harmony. There's a very simple binary structure of a repeated A section, a repeated B section, a variant of the Baroque dance with which we have been living for centuries. And to pick up Kristeva's term of a phenotext, it's a very phenotextual piece, right? It suggests a kind of transparent access to a syntactic whole. And, you know, I believe that we interpolate ourselves as subjects, not only as Althusser referred to in his little theater, when the cop says, hey, you, we turn around, and in the conversion of our 180-degree turn, piggybacking on Lacan's mirror stage, we transform what we had heard of as a you into an I. So it's another version of Wo es war soll ich werden, right? We sort of like in a binary switch, adopt a notion of subjectivity from the other. And another little emblem that I really love of this grounding of the self and the other is Rimbaud's extraordinarily visionary statement in the mid-19th century, je et un autre, right? Not just je suis un autre, which would have been interesting enough, but je et un autre, right? This sort of notion that I am a reflection of alterity. Now, what is interesting, I think, about Althusser, as I will suggest in just a few minutes, is the notion of how clean-cut interpolation is supposed to occur, right? The cop says, hey, you, we turn around, and in the binary conversion of understanding the you as an I, we move from material object into ideological subject. So far, so good. And I think if the world had remained in Paganini's world, I think we could have lived with that just fine. Jumping way across history to postmodernism, we get a piece like this. This is the George Rochberg Caprice Variation number 35. Okay, I think this is one of the great unsung masterpieces in Western music, the Caprice Variations. There are 50 of these, and all of the pieces have a red thread of continuity of A440. So there's an A natural through every single piece, and like a very strange necklace, Rochberg has composed 50 different variations that are all very paratectic takes on the history of Western music. And I believe that this piece and many others is opening the space, transforming the beautiful into two poles, a sort of upward trajectory of the sublime and the lower trajectory of the abject. I still believe what's happening even in Rochberg and in postmodernism is that the composer is taking energy from the objet art and drawing it into a kind of social space, but that social space is getting divided. And I am, let's see, I wrote a note, oh yes, from Tim's talk about the abject. I really like the idea of restoring the cycle of low and high. And I think what Rochberg is doing in this piece is he is articulating the space between the sublime and the abject without erasing either one of them. So I think this entire piece is a celebration of restoring the balance and the interrelationship between the sublime and the abject in music. And just as a footnote, I still like to think of Kant's description of the sublime in two dimensions, the dynamic and the mathematical. And I think I would like to cut and paste that to the abject and suggest that the abject equivalent of the dynamic sublime is the flesh. And very much I'm reminded of a kind of abject dynamic sublime in Vanessa's representation of the body in the talk that we just heard. And I think an abject equivalent of the mathematical sublime, a delight in infinitely large or infinitely small numbers, would be an absolute zero. So in the Rothberg, I think you still have traces of Paganini. So I think even in what we just heard, you can kind of hear the most delicate version of a tonic and a dominant, even though the technique is extremely collage-oriented. The compositional act of writing notes has been replaced by the compositional act of cutting and pasting, and the music is starting to become less syntactic and more gestural. Now, as we approach the present, whatever the present is, I would like to offer or remind us of something I think we all might be aware of already, is Mladen Dolar's critique of Althusser. So Dolar has said the following in his critique of Althusser, quote, "A part of external materiality remains that cannot be successfully integrated into the interior. Interpolation was based on a happy transition from a pre-ideological state into ideology. Successfully achieved, it wipes out the traces of its origin and results in a belief in the autonomy and self-transparency of the subject. The subject is experienced as a causa sui, in itself an inescapable illusion once the operation is completed. The psychoanalytic point of departure is the remainder produced by the operation. Psychoanalysis does not deny the cut, it only adds a remainder. The clean cut is always unclean. It cannot produce the flawless interiority of an autonomous subject. The psychoanalytic subject is coextensive with that very flaw in the interior." Now, as we move, not so chronologically, but aesthetically closer to the present, I'd like to offer you this slight excerpt from Salvatore's Sciarrino's Caprice, number 4, for solo violin. It starts very quietly. Okay, I spent quite a bit of time trying to figure out the syntax of these works until I realized that I was looking for something that wasn't there. I think that one thing that's interesting about this music is that there really is no syntax. There is no referent, really. There's a kind of immediacy of gesture, stripped clean of a syntactic penumbra, which would link it to the tradition of the beautiful and even the abject. And I think it is an evocation of a pure mathematical zero and a kind of fleshiness. And I would argue that it's an embodiment of what Dolar was suggesting is the remainder at the heart of subjectivity. And I believe what's happening in work like this is that the stripping away of syntax, the saturation of flesh, the creation of art that is a kind of aesthetic degree zero moves in toward the objet itself. I think it can never really occupy it as an object, but I think it is meant to represent the ways in which culture has opened up and in which beauty, the sublime, and the abject no longer have the kind of status that they had before. Although clearly there is still beauty in art, it's just become, I think, much more commodified and marginalized as culture has moved forward. Now I'd like to play this, Emily Howell, an excerpt from the Violin Concerto No. 1. All right, so this is obviously music played by a computer, but what I think is more interesting than the fact that it's played by a computer is that Emily Howell doesn't exist. She is a fantasy. It's an algorithm that the composer David Cope has written on the West Coast at University of California, Santa Cruz. Cope has composed, or he has written algorithms for a vast number of pieces in certain styles. And I think it's fascinating as the tip of the iceberg of a new kind of music making. And only time will tell how profound this shift from analog instruments, from human beings composing music to human beings writing algorithms, which generate music. And many of Cope's algorithms are smart. In other words, these are algorithms that grow, that learn how to adapt to certain of their own manifestations. So what I've enjoyed in teaching is to undo the binary opposition between the creative act of composition on the one hand and the artificial act of algorithmic composition on the other, and to realize that they are both, to some extent, interchangeable, right? And this is very much like the insight that Zizek has invited us to understand in Blade Runner, right? Not that replicants are artificial versions of humans, but that humans have a replicant quality in and of ourselves. So one thing I'm interested in is in the large arc of history, moving from the beauty of Paganini into the abject and sublime of postmodernism, into the remainder of post-historicism in the era in which we're living now. Where are we moving now? And what are the implications for psychoanalysis in algorithmically driven music? Particularly, what happens to the body? I mean, Vanessa's talk was so incredibly evocative about the relationship between the body, signification, and subjectivity. And where are we headed with a displacement, with a sort of teasing apart of compositional and performance agencies with a piece like the one you just heard for computer? In other words, where is the body? Can we or will we continue to have a kind of relationship to an objet outside of our own flesh? That to me is one of the extremely interesting questions about the future of art and subjectivity. Only time will tell. I tell my students who are, just teenagers that they will probably live long enough so that they will be able to answer that question after I'm long gone. And they can send me an email to wherever I happen to be at that point to let me know that things have either turned out to be not radically different or in fact radically different. And one thing I very delicately wanted to suggest in having women be the performers of all of these pieces, and it is in fact perhaps interesting why David Cope chose the name of a woman for his algorithm. It reminds me of Lacan's writing on courtly love somehow, right? To sort of equate a kind of feminine subjectivity with a kind of mechanical withholding of desire. I think maybe if he'd called his algorithm, Jack Johnson, it might have fallen somehow flat. Maybe it's more evocative to have an algorithm with a woman's name. But I'm very interested in hearing from my fellow panel members or anyone listening, whether they agree with the following statement. As a man, I'm certainly in no position to talk about what female jouissance would or would not be. I feel that the future of psychoanalysis requires a major revision, all the way back to its foundations. I believe that the Freudian and Lacanian psychoanalysis, which I love and to which I've dedicated the last 30 years, basically really, to overstate it, only tells half the story. And I'm a little puzzled why Elizabeth Bronfen's book, The Knotted Subject, hasn't taken off and sort of invited us to completely rewrite the essence of psychoanalysis from the ground up to account for a parallel drama of little boys and little girls. So I'd be very interested in hearing whether you agree with this invitation or not, whether or not psychoanalysis can, should, must, might be very substantially augmented from the ground up. Thank you.
Wow. Wow, David. So 4 continents, 4 positions, 1 question about body and psychanalyst and objet petit a. Please close your.
Oh, I need to unshare. Okay.
Of course, of course. Okay. So 1-way action, 2-way action, 3-way action, 4-way action. Of course, we have not all the day or all the night. It's just a meeting with friends between art and psychanalysts. 1-way action, perhaps, Vanessa? No?
From me?
Yeah.
I mean, I think all the talks were really great, and I like the way they all fit together with one another. I read both of Tim's books, and I really just love what Tim's doing and the energy he's bringing. And I didn't know about Christine Henriks, and of course I'm in Sweden, so I need to learn more about her clearly. So that was a fantastic introduction to her work. And as far as the automated artificial intelligence, this is something I'm naturally so kind of not naturally drawn to, but of course it's such an important topic in our world that I've been making sure to read a lot about it, through Isabel Miller's work on artificial intelligence and sex robots, and Lacanian concepts of that. And I just think it's such an interesting question, because there is this argument of what makes something intelligence, and Isabel Miller talks about we need to not even be asking about intelligence per se, but more are the machines going to suffer? Are they going to suffer and desire like humans, or is it just going to be more of a rote kind of repetition of logical structures, which is also interesting. But there's a performance artist named Stellark that I included in my book, the Scansion and Psychoanalysis book that this piece was drawn from. And his point is that humans have always been artificial to a degree, because the fact, when we look at human history, we always go when did the human become human and not just animal? And it's when we started using tools, when we started having rituals, when we started using language, and these are all already things that are attached to our animal nature. So he's we already are cyborgs, we already are these things. And that's kind of what you're saying as well. This is not just something separate from us, but this is an extension of us kind of naturally, because this is part of what we are.
True. Lovely. Which
also kind of brings us back to Tim's in the beginning, the logic versus the base animal.
That's true. That's true. We can draw together the sublime and the abject, and even the remainder. Definitely. Thank you, everyone. It's totally exciting. Very exciting.
Marcus or Tim, 1-way action? That's not an obligation. You are free.
Yeah, I really enjoyed all these talks. I'm just trying to put them together in different ways. In terms of David's talk, I mean, I would wonder a little, you know, your musical examples are all within a very particular framework of what music is. And if you expand that to, you know, the much broader set of world musics historically and now, what happens to the structures you're talking about? I think about rhythm and what the relationship of rhythm to drive and objet petit art is. And it seems to me like rhythm complicates these things, and that there's a whole world of music where not harmony and not even an individual performance, but rhythm is the kind of key. I think about, was it William Parker's definition of music as simply being sound plus rhythm. So there, like the whole question of tonality isn't even included in the definition of music. And yeah, what does rhythm say about the psyche, and what is Lacan's relationship to rhythm would be an interesting question that I actually don't have particular answers to, but I know that rhythm is a topic in psychoanalysis, and that there are certain texts about it, but it's, yeah, I would wonder about that.
No, I very much appreciate that. I don't know if you can hear me. My mic is off. Yeah, I think you're exactly right about that, and I really appreciate it, particularly because you know, there are many. Rhythm has, if you map it onto the Lacanian circle with the objet, you know, there are rhythms that move that are teleologically driven, and then there are obviously rhythms that are very static, such as in much new minimal music, and an entire continuum of teleological rhythms and static rhythms, right? From a variety of cultures, and even within the Anglo-American Western European tradition, there are many rhythms, you know, Beethoven being, for example, you know, the quintessence of a teleological driving rhythm, and Philip Glass perhaps as the quintessence of a kind of static rhythm, where there's a great deal of rhythmic motion, but it's a question of where's it going? Where does it come from? Where's it going? Does it really have a goal? And I'm sure, and Marcus, you were clearly thinking about Indian music, about which I'm not capable of really speaking, but it is an incredibly rich domain. A colleague of mine is Indian, and he plays Indian music, and I think I will ask him your question, actually. So thank you very much for that. That's a very astute and
yeah.
helpful.
If I can just briefly follow up, just something Vanessa said about rhythm. Where you described, what was it, that if you took away all the gaps from music, you would just end up with a long continuous sound. And of course, Hennigs's work is that she composes drones that are based on a continuous sound. And I think, you know, maybe this also relates to what Tim was talking about, that if you think about what the space between sounds is, not simply as an empty gap, but that there is a plenitude to that space, I think it's interesting, the questions that raises, that you know, the empty gap is not not void or neutral either, that there's a presence to the empty gap that is really worthy of thought and difficult to think about, in fact, you know, going all the way back to Bergson, whoever you want to mention, and the question of rhythm also relates to this dramatization of space and the gap in interesting ways. Yeah.
If I may just comment on that, that's a very beautiful idea. And, you know, a rather academic comment is that in, you know, in conventional music instruction, we always lament the fact that music is written in such a way that the notes are very isolated from each other, that's got nothing to do with the way you're supposed to play it, right? You're supposed to play notes that are very, very connected. But there's something about notation which implicitly acknowledges the material plenitude of the space between the notes, because notes are actually written as individual things separated by space. So that's that may be a kind of unconscious thing that we have incorporated into music notation for centuries without even being aware of it. So thank you. That's a wonderful idea.
Thanks.
Yes. I give you the last words, Tim.
Oh, thank you. No pressure.
Because it's not the morning for you in Australia.
It's after 12 o'clock. We actually had daylight savings, which pushed everything forward an hour too. So my 10 p.m. start became 11 p.m. start, but I had a big cup of coffee before we started, so I'm okay. Just two thoughts. They might just be random free associations, but one was on the question of feminine jouissance, because there's a sense where feminine jouissance might generally refer to receptivity. And a man maybe cannot experience it to the same extent as a woman, but there is a sense by taking the anus as the object of penetration that they can experience something of feminine jouissance in that way. Receptivity can also be not directly sexual, like for example, Lacan says, I wrote the écrit from the position of feminine jouissance. Then there's also the sense where Lacan talks about feminine jouissance in terms of something non-phallic, something to do with the knothole and going beyond the phallus, which, you know, is something almost otherworldly in terms of receptivity. That was one idea. The other idea I had was in relation to, so that was it was in response to David's question. The other one was in relation to Vanessa's talk about how the cut can open up sort of LGBT performativity of identities. It's not mere performances, of course, but as one's, you know, true nature coming out, that there's a sense where, say, a trans woman may also open up the sort of the cut from the neuroticization that, say, a cisgendered female subject might have to actually perform her heterosexual cisgendered femininity in a more open, affirmative way, in a more open sexual, erotic way, where she might have otherwise been inhibited by that. And I confess I'm partly inspired by the bloom of your youth in your video montage and the way you attack the lens and attract the gaze. And it's very striking and very skillful. So that's all I have to say for now. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, Genesis and Lady J are fantastic, and like Marcus said, he's able to share his work with Christina and have her feedback. And you know, when I first started writing on Genesis and Lady J, I started writing on them after encountering Genesis and becoming in a relationship with them, and like started just like seeing like how much of the theory was kind of like evident in their work, and it just kept writing and writing, and then being able to share that with Jen, and then Jen reading it and like not knowing any of these concepts and saying, you know, like, wow, it's so interesting to see, like now I'm seeing my work and what I was doing in a way that for me, I was just doing it and I wasn't really thinking about what I was doing in a conceptual way. It was just like something they were feeling compelled to do. And then like having these concepts behind it was really interesting. It's really amazing to be able to do that with the artists. And as far as Christina too, and her wanting there to be a logical method to be able to invoke chance, I think that just the practice of that, you know, just having a practice, a daily practice, and like doing your work, creative work regularly, you know, makes those opportunities happen more and more. Like the more time you spend, you know, in your practice, the more chances you get to that state, you know. I guess it's not guaranteed every time, but neither is like a psychoanalytic session. You know, you meet 5 days a week, you have a lot more chances of getting the work done than if you meet once a week, you know.
So one people in the place new message. Thank you for all the interesting presentation. Thank you, Zena Deme. I have a message for you, Marcus. Please send hello and stay safe to Christine Enix from us. And perhaps if nobody wants to say anything else, I can say, perhaps with a bad English, a short conclusion, but not a conclusion, but I can say some words. Barbara, you can take the microphone. We need to hear your voice, Barbara. It's on the chat. It's for the recorded because nobody, yeah, of course, please.
I'm here. Thank you so much. No, it was really, really interesting. So we will travel all this day from absolutely avant-garde from France. I'm from Paris. I'm sociologist. I'm not a psychanalyst, and I really never really read Jacques Lacan.
Quelle horreur, Barbara. No, please.
But yeah, I'm interested in avant-garde, from classic avant-garde till Beat Generation, and so thank you very much for the film, and to Vanessa, and it was really, really interesting to see this different way, would I say, in the male, to go finally to some same path of liberation, of suffering, like a Buddhist say, or Hindu. And that's I can to say from erotism or from logic of mathematics or sciences. It's a little bit the same path, even that the way are very, very different. So yeah, thank you so much. And you can see some environment in my room of the Buddhist change circle coming from Tibet, and thank you so much.
Yeah, the way from Georges Bataille to Jacques Lacan and the Buddhism it's for the next year, for the birth of John Cage. So I propose a next meeting.
By silence, yeah.
Yes, of course. We can invent another way, another connection between situationist and Jacques Lacan. It's another way, but thank you so much.
What I'm thinking that some voice very spontaneously, like, coming from Dubuffet, Art Brut, or something more spontaneously. It's a nice intervention, more construction of situation, and which we lose from internet now because it's too much frame.
Of course. I made an interview with Christophe Bourseiller, who is a friend with Genesis Pure Ridge, and he was a specialist about situationist story and his story. And we spoke with a connection with a Danish review and Jacques Lacan. But all is not closed, all is not no, inconscient is real. I said, thank you so much for accept my invitation and to work my bad English. I'm working for a meeting about John Cage, and perhaps next year by Zoom or in a place on the planet, David. It will be a good pleasure to invite you. I'm very, very happy for your meeting. That's the end of your meeting, but arts are unless like the analytic device. Thank you so much to the 4 talks and people connected with us now, and in the future by the recorded. If you are okay, you publish it on YouTube channel, and now it's in Facebook, in my Facebook account and another group on Facebook. Stay safe and breathe your experience over time. A big hello to Christine Enix by way of Marcus, with my heart. And I hope to organize an exhibition one day in Paris. It's difficult about Christine Enix. So have a nice day. for some people, or a nice night for other people in function where you are now in your planet. I say just bye-bye and see you soon by screen or in another place on the planet. And thank you so much for your presentation, dangerous words, and Viva Beat Generation and all avant-garde in real time. Perhaps you can see just in there the catalogue of a surrealist exhibition by Friedrich Kiesler, but it's for another point. And for another meeting, perhaps I have some question to Tim about the text of Georges Bataille and meditation. Another way, but stay in life, and thank you so much. Bye-bye, all people. I close the real time on Facebook.
Take care, everyone.